July 1943. Across the endless fields of southern Russia, thousands of armored vehicles roar to life. German Panther tanks, Tiger heavy tanks, self-propelled guns, assault guns. Engines scream as entire Panzer divisions surge forward across the steppe. For Adolf Hitler, this offensive is supposed to change everything. Just months earlier, Germany suffered one of its greatest disasters at Stalingrad. An entire army had been destroyed. The myth of German invincibility had begun to crack. Now Hitler wants revenge. His plan is simple: smash the Soviet armies at Kursk with the most powerful concentration of armored forces ever assembled. Crush the Red Army in one decisive battle. If it works, Germany might regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. If it fails, the war in the East could be lost forever. But what Hitler doesn't realize is that the Soviet Union already knows exactly what is coming. And the battlefield waiting for the German tanks is not a breakthrough opportunity. It is a carefully prepared trap. The Battle of Kursk would become the largest tank battle in human history. And the moment Hitler's Panzer armies were doomed. By early 1943, the Eastern Front had already become the largest and most brutal battlefield the world had ever seen. After the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, German forces were pushed back across hundreds of kilometers of territory. But the front line did not collapse completely. Instead, it stabilized around a massive bulge in Soviet territory near the city of Kursk. On maps, it looked like a giant protrusion in the German lines. To the German high command, it seemed like an opportunity. If German forces attacked the bulge from the north and the south at the same time, they could encircle and destroy the Soviet armies trapped inside. It would be a classic maneuver, something the German army had done many times before. The operation was given a name: Operation Citadel. Hitler ordered some of Germany's most powerful units to prepare for the offensive. Elite Panzer divisions, heavy Tiger tanks, brand new Panther tanks, even massive armored vehicles like the Ferdinand tank destroyer. In total, Germany assembled around 800,000 soldiers and nearly 3,000 armored vehicles for the attack. But there was a problem. The longer Germany waited to launch the offensive, the more time the Soviet Union had to prepare. And Hitler kept delaying the attack. He wanted more tanks, more weapons, more reinforcements. Those delays would prove fatal. While German commanders debated when to attack, the Soviet Union began preparing for the inevitable. Unlike earlier in the war, the Red Army was no longer surprised by German plans. Thanks to intelligence reports, reconnaissance, and even intercepted communications, Soviet leaders knew exactly where the attack would come, and they prepared accordingly. The Kursk salient became the most heavily fortified battlefield in history. Over months, Soviet soldiers and civilians built an enormous defensive system. Thousands of kilometers of trenches, deep anti-tank ditches, barbed wire obstacles, hidden artillery positions. But the most dangerous weapons buried in the soil were mines. Hundreds of thousands of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. Entire fields were transformed into lethal traps for advancing armored vehicles. Behind the first defensive lines, the Soviets built second and third lines. And even deeper behind those, massive reserve armies waited. If the Germans broke through the first defenses, they would face new armies ready to counterattack. By the summer of 1943, the Soviets had deployed nearly 2 million soldiers and over 5,000 tanks around Kursk. The Germans were walking into the most heavily defended battlefield they had ever faced. On July 5, 1943, the battle began. Before the Germans could even launch their attack, Soviet artillery opened fire across the front. The Red Army had predicted the exact moment the Germans would attack. Shells rained down on German assembly areas, disrupting preparations and causing chaos. But the German offensive went forward anyway. In the north, General Walter Model's 9th Army attacked south toward Kursk. In the south, powerful Panzer formations advanced north under General Hermann Hoth. Their goal was to smash through Soviet defenses and meet in the middle, trapping the Red Army. At first, German tanks rolled forward across the fields, but almost immediately they encountered the Soviet defenses. Minefields exploded beneath their tracks. Anti-tank guns fired from concealed positions. Artillery shells crashed into advancing formations. The German advance slowed dramatically. Instead of fast breakthroughs like earlier in the war, the fighting became slow, brutal, and incredibly costly. Every kilometer of ground had to be fought for. The most famous moment of the battle came on July 12th. Near the small village of Prokhorovka, two massive armored forces collided. Hundreds of German tanks and assault guns advanced towards Soviet positions. At the same time, the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army launched a huge counterattack. What followed became one of the most chaotic armored battles in history. Hundreds of tanks charged across the open fields. Dust, smoke, and fire filled the air. At such close distances, long-range German guns lost some of their advantage. Soviet tanks rushed forward, trying to close the distance and overwhelm the enemy. Some battles happened at point-blank range. Tanks rammed each other, armor-piercing shells slammed into steel hulls, vehicles exploded into flames, crews bailed out or burned inside their machines. The battlefield became a graveyard of twisted metal. Although the Germans destroyed many Soviet tanks, they failed to achieve the decisive breakthrough they needed, and time was running out. While the battle raged at Kursk, events elsewhere in the war were changing the situation. In the Mediterranean, Allied forces had just invaded Sicily. For Hitler, this created a new crisis. German forces were needed to defend southern Europe. At the same time, the offensive at Kursk was not producing the decisive victory he wanted. German forces had advanced only a few dozen kilometers after days of brutal fighting. Losses were mounting. The Red Army still had massive reserves ready to fight. On July 13th, Hitler made a crucial decision. He ordered Operation Citadel to be stopped. The offensive was cancelled. For the first time in the war, a major German summer offensive on the Eastern Front had failed completely. The Battle of Kursk did not end when the German attack stopped. In many ways, the real turning point was just beginning. The Red Army immediately launched powerful counteroffensives. Fresh Soviet armies attacked weakened German positions. Cities like Orel and Kharkov became major battlegrounds. German forces were pushed back again and again. The initiative on the Eastern Front had permanently shifted. From this point forward, the Red Army would remain on the offensive for the rest of the war. Germany would never again launch a major strategic offensive in the East. Looking back, historians have identified several reasons why the German offensive at Kursk failed. First, the element of surprise was gone. The Soviets knew the attack was coming and prepared enormous defensive lines. Second, the battlefield itself favored the defenders. Minefields, anti-tank guns, and layered defenses slowed the German advance. Third, German technology did not deliver the decisive advantage expected. Many new tanks, especially the Panthers, suffered mechanical failures early in the battle. Finally, the Soviet Union had grown immensely stronger since the early years of the war. The Red Army had more tanks, more soldiers, and far greater reserves. Even if the Germans had broken through the first defensive lines, the Soviets had the strength to continue fighting. Kursk proved that Germany could no longer defeat the Soviet Union through offensive operations. The scale of the Battle of Kursk was staggering. More than 3 million soldiers took part in the fighting. Over 6,000 tanks and armored vehicles clashed across the battlefield. Thousands of aircraft filled the skies. Casualties were enormous. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Entire armored divisions were shattered. Although both sides suffered heavy losses, the Soviet Union could replace its tanks and soldiers far faster than Germany. For the German army, the battle represented a devastating loss of experienced troops and equipment. Losses that could never fully be replaced. The Battle of Kursk marked a decisive turning point on the Eastern Front. After this battle, the Red Army gained the strategic initiative permanently. German forces would spend the rest of the war retreating westward. From the fields of Kursk, the Soviet advance would eventually lead all the way to Berlin. For Hitler, the dream of defeating the Soviet Union had effectively ended. The Panzer armies that once swept across Europe had finally met an opponent strong enough to stop them. And at Kursk, the steel storm that Hitler hoped would restore German power instead proved one brutal truth. His Panzers had been doomed from the start. History is written in fire, steel, and sacrifice. Across centuries, soldiers have marched into the chaos of battle, shaping the fate of nations and empires. Here on Wounds of War, we return to those battlefields to uncover the conflicts that changed the world. If you want to explore more of these stories, join us. Subscribe to the channel because many more battles await, and the next story of war is just over the horizon.